to a Weekly Stuff bonus podcast for the month of September. I'm Jonathan Lack.
And I'm Sean Chapman.
And we are here once again to talk about classic Doctor Who.
Yes, for the second time and for the second Doctor.
So if you have been listening to the Weekly Stuff podcast for any length of time, you know that we are huge Doctor Who fans. Although I say any length of time, if you came in recently listening to us talk about Twin Peaks, believe it or not, we also love Doctor Who.
Yeah.
And that is why we are doing a series of supplemental podcasts in which we revisit classic Doctor Who stories, going, for this first run at least, one from each of the original 7. We'll see what we do about Doctor 8.
Yeah, I got some ideas.
I think there's a lot of fun things we could do, but each of the 7 original Doctors, and we will talk about a story from each of them. Last month, for our first episode, we did the Aztecs with William Hartnell, the first Doctor, and this month we are doing Tomb of the Cybermen with the second Doctor, Patrick Troughton. Sean here has seen every episode of Doctor Who, classic and modern, and I have seen fewer of the classic Doctor Who episodes.
Yeah, little samplings here and there.
So you're picking ones that are new for me as well, so we can have that mix of perspectives. So you're curating the episodes, and so I'm going to let you go off here in a second and tell us about Tomb of the Cybermen. Remember, this is a Patreon early access exclusive, so if you like these Doctor Who episodes, subscribe to our Patreon. You'll get them a week early. This week we got this one out a little later in the month than we intended because September was crazy.
Yeah, September was really crazy, and we had to shift the schedule back for the main podcast and everything. But yeah, now this will be back on a normal monthly schedule.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about Tomb of the Cybermen, but also get into, this is Patrick Troughton.
Yeah.
Listeners will probably know that he is not only your favorite Doctor, but I think just one of your favorite people. You use him as your Twitter avatar.
Yes. Yeah.
Most people think that's what you look like.
And maybe it is what I look like. They don't know.
Yeah.
I don't put pictures of myself on the internet to create that mystique, because who knows? Maybe I look exactly like Patrick Troughton.
Maybe you are a Time Lord, and in one of your generations, you just decided to look like Patrick Troughton.
It's totally possible. I'm not here to answer those questions. Those are questions you have to answer for yourself. So I want to kind of do what I did for the last episode, because again, this first sort of like series of us doing classic Doctor Who episodes is about sort of me picking what I think is an exemplary episode from each era of Doctor Who, basically, and an episode that is great both for being able to sort of talk about that Doctor actor and about that sort of era in Doctor Who. So we did the Aztecs last time as a true historical episode, which means a historical episode that has no fantasy or science fiction components at all. It is just the TARDIS crew lands in some historical period and has to figure out what the fuck's going on. How do I resolve this situation and get out of here? Which is a sort of episode style that is pretty unique to that era of Doctor Who. And so for this one, we're doing Tomb of the Cybermen, which is a story that is pretty remarkable for a number of different reasons, like beyond just its sheer quality, which I think is, among the best Doctor Who serials ever. It is also used as a template for a lot of different sort of kinds of Doctor Who stories that are particularly common nowadays, of the Doctor and companion crews sort of like intercept in some way some kind of scientific endeavor, and then that is trying to uncover something. It's like Silence of the Library is a good example of a modern version of this kind of story. And so the Doctor is kind of having to deal with this other scientific investigation and with their like weird interpersonal struggles, while also trying to figure out what like monster they're fighting, like Under the Flood, or Under the Lake and Beneath and Before the Flood, or whatever the fuck those titles are from season 9 are also examples of that kind of story.
And it's one of the things that struck me the most about this story, and I want to talk about, is how thoroughly modern it feels. Some effects aside, obviously, you could just take this script, produce it with Peter Capaldi, and you wouldn't really miss a beat.
Yeah.
Which is an amazing thing about it.
Yeah, it is just, because it's just an incredibly well-made Doctor Who story, because it is one of the things that most classic Doctor Who stories, the direction and stuff like that is very flat most of the time because of the conditions and like the very extreme conditions they were made under, and it is the mark of a fantastic director and of a fantastic piece of work if you have a classic Doctor Who episode where the direction and the pacing and those kinds of things hold up, which is true of the Aztecs, is true of Tomb of the Cybermen for sure. Another element of Tomb of the Cybermen that I think makes it good to talk about with specifically the second Doctor era is that it is written by Kit Peddler and Gerry Davis. Kit Peddler, if you have listened to my massive Cyberman lecture from the end of our season 10 Modern Doctor Who podcast stuff, Kit Peddler was the inventor of the Cybermen, and he's a scientist by trade, and so he really, when they hired him to write for Doctor Who, one of the things that he really wanted to bring to the show was having like more of this sort of like science perspective, and in creating the Cybermen, he wanted to sort of project into the future of like, oh, like what if, 1,000 years in the future or something, what we're doing now with like prosthetics and those kinds of things of replacing, of like having pacemakers on hearts and replacing lost limbs with prosthetic limbs and that kind of stuff, all that's good now, but what is like 1,000 years, the most extreme version of that? What could that do to humanity? And that was kind of the foundation of the Cybermen. And so he came back to write the Moon Base, which is the second Cyberman story, because obviously he wrote the 10th Planet, where the Cybermen came from, which is the last First Doctor story. Then wrote the Moon Base, which is sort of in the middle of season 4, which season 4 is the second Doctor's first season. And then Tomb of the Cybermen is the first serial from the 5th season. And so he kind of, every time they brought the Cybermen back for like up to here, Kit Peddler was involved, and then they brought Gerry Davis, who was another writer, on. Kit Peddler and Gerry Davis would then later go on to make the BBC show Doom Watch, which I have not seen, but from what I understand, it's a very well received, like very well liked other sort of classic BBC sci-fi show. And so they sort of together define for me that kind of like early Second Doctor period, where the last Second Doctor season kind of shifts a bit stylistically, but there is in the early Second Doctor stuff, you have more of that kind of like trying to have some sort of scientific component to it as well, and taking more from that world and having it be more like sci-fi, which is like, not to say it's like, the hardest science fiction in the world. This is not 2001: A Space Odyssey, but compared to what Doctor Who was for most of the First Doctor era, and honestly what Doctor Who was like past this period, this to me characterizes more like, compared to other science fiction being made from that era, the kind of stuff they're talking about here is in some ways kind of plausible, but is also sort of interrogative and investigative of it in a scientific nature, with Tomb of the Cybermen bringing in a lot of stuff about archaeology, with obviously they're sort of uncovering this tomb, and then talking about logic and emotion and those questions. It's more of a science fiction kind of story, and that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to pick this one to be the Second Doctor one, because I think that element of it is distinctly of this era of Doctor Who to me.
And if I'm not mistaken, the Second Doctor squared off against the Cybermen an awful lot.
Yes, that it was like his main thing of like that. Definitely, he has like 2 or 3 Dalek serials, but it is like the Cybermen popped up a lot for the Second Doctor, and is definitely like a defining enemy for his era. And with this, but they weren't like concentrated in the way they were here.
And some good Cybermen stories. But that one, which is phenomenal, and it's kind of interesting because if you look at the year in modern Doctor Who, and you look at this, and it's like, well, that was actually kind of a regular thing for Patrick Troughton.
Way more interesting in this story than they were like in once like the 4th Doctor. Cybermen have just been robots, and that's it. And in Tomb of the in like 10th, that's that kind of collection of the original Cybermen stories, quote unquote. The Cybermen have a much more distinct identity of having that sort of like emotion, logic, sort of disconnect is a much more part of the plot and the story, the theme of these stories. I think the Cybermen in the Second Doctor era are fantastic. It's one of the things that I've always wished that Doctor Who would go back and be like, let's make the Cybermen cool again, and finally they have with season 10 and New Doctor Who. It took a long fucking time to get back to that place. But yes, the Cybermen are great.
All right, so Sean, I had one other question I wanted to ask.
All right.
This is like, in many ways, Patrick Troughton's most iconic story.
Yeah.
And part of that is because, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first story of his that is fully extant, right?
The earliest, yes.
The earliest, yeah. Because I was looking at the list, and all of his ones from season 4 are missing all or some of the episodes.
Yeah.
So this is like, for many people, their entry point to Patrick Troughton, kind of period.
Yes, yeah. If you wanted to just sort of like go through the fully existing serials and only watch those for the Second Doctor, this would be the first one you'd see.
Yeah, so it's interesting. This one carries a lot of weight behind it. And when we talked about the Aztecs last month, that one carries a weight behind it too, but I don't know if it's quite as iconic as like Tomb of the Cybermen.
Yeah, because I think also there's a fun part of Tomb of the Cybermen is that it was like when it aired, it was widely regarded to be one of the best Doctor Who stories for good reason, but then obviously like how that worked back in the day was like it aired And then, bleh, like, you didn't see it again. You didn't, like, nobody had fucking VHS recorders and stuff like that back then. So...
It was 1967.
Yes, 1967. So it was just, it aired, it was broadcast, and then it was basically done. And then, the BBC didn't have the sort of foresight to realize, oh, wait, these things are important historical documents, and people are going to care about this in the future at some point. And so... most of them were wiped. I mean, basically all of them were wiped because the only way that we still have any of these stories is mostly from like secondhand recordings that have been touched up and fixed and stuff like that.
You might even notice that the video quality on this is actually not as good as the Aztecs.
Yeah.
It looks like a little rougher than that one did.
Because, I mean, this is all would have been pieced together by secondhand recordings and having to be touched up by all these different sort of like computer algorithms and stuff to make it not look crazy.
It's just an interesting thing for me with Tomb of the Cybermen that I was watching this since, like, I had not seen this full serial before, but I knew images from it. Mm-hmm. It carries a weight. There's particularly in the second episode, there are some images that you'll look at them like, I've seen that somewhere.
Yeah, there's images and lines that like if you've seen any sort of like thing that the BBC has put together on YouTube or on TV of like, oh, we're doing a classic Doctor Who marathon, or it's like, here's like our tribute to the second Doctor era. They'll take a lot of clips from Tomb of the Cybermen. But yeah, it was originally believed to have been completely lost for a long time until 1991 is when they found it and then had to like touch it up and like put it back out there. And it was one of the first serials to be recovered in that way and then put out onto home video. So I think it is also iconic for that reason of, to me, it's like sort of like emblematic of that movement to sort of like find and recover lost episodes of Doctor Who, because again, like basically the entirety of of Patrick Troughton's first season 4 is lost, at least in the serials are lost either in their entirety or there's like one episode extant, and that's also true for most of season 5 with the exception of Tomb of the Cybermen and then a couple of them like Enemy of the World that have been recovered recently, and then season 6 is the only one that is mostly still there. There's still a couple of episodes missing, but it's mostly there.
Yeah.
But yeah, Tomb of the Cybermen, it has a very interesting history behind it as well, which is appropriate for the themes, the archaeological themes of Tomb of the Cybermen.
Very true. So where did you want to take this next?
I think let's go ahead and dive into the story, and we can talk about the Second Doctor and everything like that in the context of Tomb of the Cybermen. Because I want to talk about this, because I'm excited to talk about this, because, Jonathan, this is the first time you've seen it, so yes. I want to hear your impressions from it.
Okay, so here's the thing about Tomb of the Cybermen. We've talked before about how the Doctor Who serials, one of the things you can kind of trust on with pace for a lot of them is if it's 4 episodes, 1 and 4 will be awesome, and 2 and 3 will be a little
Yeah.
This is not that serial.
No, yeah.
I think by far the one that felt the weakest to me in the moment, and I wouldn't say this in retrospect, was episode 1, where I started. It's like, well, this is okay, but it's a lot of laying the groundwork. They're like, they land on some mysterious planet, and they're going around. There's a new companion in this one, Victoria, and we're kind of getting to know her. And, Jamie and the Doctor are broing out, which is awesome. There's a great gag in the first episode with the two of them, because Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines were just buddies. Uh-huh. And so that's great. But it's like, it's very, very slow. It's very atmospheric. It is technobabble-y, but as you say, Kit Peddler was a scientist, and you can kind of tell that because it sounds like technobabble written by someone who knows what it means.
Yes, it's not just random science-y sounding words.
Yes, and you're just you're exploring, you're trying to see, like, what is this? They're in a tomb, there's maybe some Cybermen. You kind of suspect that there's going to be something bad that happens, because it'd be weird if it didn't. Yeah. But otherwise, you're kind of waiting for things to happen. And then the end of episode 1 is one of the most shocking and brutal moments I've ever seen on Doctor Who, which is there's this weird hypnosis thing happening, and then this, like, ray comes out from the back. One of our guest stars is just shot in the back and killed. Uh-huh. Jamie is standing right next to him, and then a Cyberman pops out. Boom, go to episode 2. And that was like, okay, I get it. And then it's like, that so sets the tone for episodes 2, 3, and 4. This is a serial that is brutal. Like, most of the guest stars die. And not in the sense of, like, modern Doctor Who, where they do that sometimes, but you don't really feel the impact as you do here, where, when modern guest stars die today, it's often, there's a weird monster that kills them, or it's by accident. Most of the deaths here are just humans killing other humans.
Yeah.
Or you have the Cybermen doing it, but that means there's always, like, this brutal impact of someone, like, pulling a gun on someone else and just firing at them. So it's just brutal. There are moments of incredible suspense. It is probably the best directed episode of Classic Who I've seen. I can't think of one that I've seen that is more impressively directed than this. There are just some really standout sequences, particularly in the second and third episodes. And then all this stuff with the Cybermen, like, the Cybermen are so... It's so easy to look at them and just kind of laugh, because in Modern Who especially, they're just robot men who walk around and stomp, and, they're basically like robot Gestapo, and they walk around and do evil things. In this, they are truly scary, they are fairly unpredictable, and they're maybe not even the biggest threat going on in this story. And all of that means that this is a story that is just full of, it is dread, it is chilling, it is shocking, and if it can be this shocking and chilling in the year 2017, it makes me think, like, did people, like, have heart attacks when this aired? Like, it's kind of like looking at the movie Psycho or something and knowing that, like, it fucked people up when it came out. I imagine this serial had to have done the same. And you also understand, like, when people... today talk about Tomb of the Cybermen as like a flashpoint for them in their Doctor Who fandom. Or like for Matt Smith, for instance, them playing the Doctor. He was hugely influenced by this down to costume choices. And it's like, I get it. I totally get it. This is not one where you watch it and you're like, okay, it's historical and interesting. It's like, I viscerally get that. And it is a damn good story.
Yeah, I think the thing that impresses me the most about it, because I've seen it like 4 or 5 times at this point, is that it totally feels to me like you could tell me that this was just a classic sci-fi movie from like the 30s to the 50s, somewhere in that era.
Yeah.
And I would just believe you. Like, you just edit it together into one movie, and I would be like, yeah, that's like, put that in a like fucking like marathon with The Thing from Another World and Forbidden Planet, and I would just believe you. Like, it totally fits in. The direction is totally solid. The acting is fantastic. The writing is really great. And it has that sense of pace, and it has like this really like present violence in it that you're identifying there with like how guest stars are being killed, and like you said, like they're not just sort of like killed by some weird special effect, like they're just shot, like they're just straight up shot by like actual guns, because or like obviously prop guns, like they're not actually shooting people, but they have like prop guns that look like real guns shooting blanks and stuff like that. And then the Cybermen just shoot lightning and fucking fry people, and smoke bellows out of them, and they collapse on the floor.
And it's that combined, and this is, and we'll talk about later, this is very much the blueprint for a lot of Doctor Who to come. And, like the base under siege kind of story, which we see all the time. What makes this one feel especially dangerous to me is 2 things. There's, like, the brutality and the direction that you're talking about. But also, like, this is still early enough in the show's run. The Doctor is, certainly under Patrick Troughton, becoming the superhero legend he'll become.
Sure.
But he's not that yet.
Yeah.
He's still transitioning kind of out of the William Hartnell and becoming a new man. And within that means the Doctor isn't all-knowing. He isn't, he doesn't have an answer for every single situation. It's a lot of, you can just tell on Patrick Troughton's face, he's like, I don't know if we're going to get out of here. I'm 450 years old.
Yeah.
That could be it. Like, they're all just ready to, like, knowing that, like, the only goal here is to get the fuck out of this base, and there's nothing else we can do.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. And I think that is something that's really fun about some classic Doctor Who stories, is that there's an element of danger that, with the exception of, I think, like, the Capaldi era has done generally a good job with this, too. But it's really hard with later Doctors to bring that same sense to it,
Yeah. Yeah, because it's something that Patrick Troughton does really well. And I think also Peter Davison as the 5th Doctor did a really good job of playing the Doctor as someone who is physically vulnerable, which is something that, like, it's fine if the Doctor's not like that. Like, I think, like, we're going to do John Pertwee next month, and he is, like, the most physically powerful Doctor of all of them. And so it's fine for him to have this sort of, like, physically commanding presence in some senses. But there is something I really love about like, when the Doctor has to, like, stare down a Cyberman, he doesn't win that staring contest, like, at all. He has to immediately pull out and be like, I need to, like, reconsider my approach, because this guy could just squash me into a pancake. And then there's not that, the Doctor can't do the thing of, like, what do you think has happened every other time the Cybermen have seen me? They lost. He can't give that speech and just make them freak out.
It's not true yet.
Yeah, exactly. It's not true. And it's like, the dramatic reality of those confrontations is that the Doctor is always at a disadvantage, and like at a real disadvantage that Patrick Troughton plays in such a way that you feel that, like, he is in danger. Like, if he doesn't play this right, he will be fucking killed the way that everyone else is getting killed in this episode. And I think that's a really important tool to building that tension. That is something that, again, it's just sort of like the nature of how long that show has gone, that you just lose that because you have to lose that, because it becomes absurd to try to maintain that with this character having that much of a history. But it is very refreshing in some ways to go back to classic Doctor Who and, like, rediscover that, like, right, yes, like, this is, He is smarter than most of these people, but he is not invincible in the slightest.
Also, what a great trial by fire this story is for new companion Victoria,
Yeah.
who I don't know a ton about. I have seen her in one other serial, The Enemy of the World, which was recovered a few years ago. And I like her a lot, and I actually love how she's used in this. I also love the idea of, like, this is her first adventure in outer space. And because I don't know what the story with her is. There's a scene that's phenomenal that addresses some of her backstory. But I just love that, like, most companions get to go on a fun, light adventure their first time out. She did not.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so yeah, let's talk about the companions for a second here. So we've got, let's talk about Victoria first. So you have Victoria Waterfield, played by Deborah Watling, who was introduced at the end of, I think it's Evil of the Daleks, which is the last serial of season 4. And she's introduced in that story as she's sort of like this Victorian, like, well-to-do lady, and her dad is killed over the course of that story, which is addressed in Tomb of the Cybermen. One of the other things that's sort of remarkable about Tomb of the Cybermen is how, like, in continuity it feels, which is very rare for Doctor Who at all, but for classic Doctor Who in particular, it's like there's like direct references to the last 2 times we've seen the Cybermen, and like there's a character continuity with Victoria that persists from the last serial through this one, and she has like an actual character arc through this whole story. So yeah, like, this is her first big adventure on the TARDIS. You have that great scene at the beginning where where Patrick Troughton, which is kind of like a pickup from the end of the last story, where Patrick Troughton is introducing her to the TARDIS and is like, "This is my home." Well, it has been for some while. It's one of those scenes that, like, that's a scene, and those clips are played all the time as, like, that's the second Doctor, and she has to go change out of her Victorian outfit. And so, yeah, she's this sort of fresh new companion over the course of this story. I think Victoria has never been one of the more memorable companions to me, but I do appreciate that. One, she's Victorian, so it's like she's not just contemporary British woman. This, like, modern Doctor Who still hasn't caught up to. Let's get someone from at least, like, slightly displaced in time. Like, that's only about 100 years from when this was aired. So it's like, she wasn't that old-fashioned, but old-fashioned enough that it's like, yes, you're a slightly different person. And so I appreciate that about her, and I do think she's really good in this story, and they give her some good stuff. I love when she has the gun, and she just blasts a Cybermat with this fucking pistol, like she's James Bond or some shit. That's really good.
That's really good, and leads to one of the best Patrick Troughton scenes ever, right? I mean, God, like, we'll talk about it more later, I'm sure, but there's a scene where he has kind of a heart-to-heart with her that I watched that scene and I felt like I could see the next 50 years of Doctor Who being written. Right. That's one of those scenes where it's like, that's a scene that allowed this thing to keep going. I can see every other Doctor in that moment. I can see that kind of moment recurring through every other Doctor's run, and just such a key watershed moment for the show. And, you know, so you got to give Victoria props for that.
Yeah, no.
She made it happen.
Absolutely. So then our other companion, because this is old Doctor Who, so we're still rolling with a bit of a crew here. It's not the full 3 companion set of the first Doctor, but we have 2 companions here, and the other companion is, of course, the fantastic Jamie Mccremen, played by Fraser Hines.
I love Jamie.
Yeah, so he is the stalwart, constant companion of the second Doctor, who is introduced very early on in season 4 in the story The Highlanders, which I think is the second Doctor story. So it's like very immediately the Doctor encounters Jamie, and he's like a 19th century Scottish Highlander who is all wrapped up in this like conflict in that story, and he's sort of a violent but well-meaning, sort of like slightly dim Scottish boy that joins the Doctor on his adventures, and he stays with him all the way through the entirety of Patrick Troughton's run, all the way through to the War Games. Like, one of the longest-running companions in the show.
And one of the best.
Yes, like, absolutely one of the best. He's phenomenal.
Oh, he's phenomenal. He always has to be in contention. If you're naming the best Doctor Who companions, Jamie's got to be on the list. You don't get Patrick Troughton's second Doctor without him.
Yeah.
Because he's just, they're so a pair. And Jamie I love him. Fraser Hines just seems like he's having so much fun whenever you watch him do this. He always, I think, has, like, they have interesting ways of writing Jamie. He has interesting ways as an actor of approaching every scene.
Yeah.
And he just brings a very different energy, because it's also like, we don't get a lot of Doctor Who bromances. You know, he is the primary companion to the second Doctor, and he's a man. We do get male companions elsewhere, you know, like you've got like maybe Rory for the 11th Doctor, but you wouldn't call him like companion A. He's like companion B, you know? And Jamie is just, he's the main guy. He and the Doctor just seem like buds, and they're hanging out throughout the universe. I love also, it's another example of what you were talking about, that he's not just some Scottish dude he went out and found in 1967.
Yeah.
He's from, like, the past. And I like you... That seems counterintuitive to us now because they never do that on Doctor Who, but you're like, well, the TARDIS would be just as surprising to someone from the past as it would be someone now.
Yeah. In some ways, like, who Jamie is and where he comes from means that he, like, kind of accepts it better than most characters do. Like, and that's one of my favorite parts of Jamie, is how he just rolls with everything he encounters because it's all utterly mystifying to him. So it's like, it doesn't matter, like, how much more absurd the TARDIS is from the Tomb of the Cybermen. It's all so outside his fucking, like, purview that he just accepts all of it and rolls with all of it and just trusts the Doctor 100% and is just willing to do whatever to sort of, like, resolve the situation and help his buddy.
And this isn't even a particularly Jamie-heavy story. If you want to see, like, Jamie's best moments, there are other serials to visit. But, like, he is very good in this one, and it's just a reminder that, like, you know, because it's hard to see the Second Doctor's run, much of it is gone, and you have to watch it through reconstructions, you can just pick up any Second Doctor story, and you will get the relationship between Jamie and the Doctor. And that's a testament to how good they are, how good the writing is.
Yeah.
That you don't need to see that relationship chronologically. It just, in whatever moment you catch it, it's what it is.
Absolutely. It's just that chemistry between Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines is legendary. It's just so... It's so good. And it is something that when you're only used to modern Doctor Who, it's really refreshing to see this, like, what a male companion can be on the show, what that kind of relationship and that dynamic can be, is a lot of fun.
And Fraser Hines, if I'm not mistaken, because, I mean, he and Patrick Troughton were friends in real life.
Yeah.
And Patrick Troughton, sadly, one of our 3 deceased Doctors. And so Fraser Hines has played the Second Doctor in Big Finish stories.
Yeah, he does a really, really good Patrick Troughton impression. So yes, he does.
And that's just, there's something about that warms my heart. You know? That's just a cool thing to, like, you know, many, many years later come back and say, like, you know, hey, I knew that performance better than anyone. I was on set every day. I'll do it.
Yeah.
And that's cool. So anyway, where do we want to go next?
So that's our companions. Let's go to let's go to the beginning of Tomb of the Cybermen, because Tomb of the Cybermen, other than we have that little, like, sort of, like, scene that is from the end of the previous serial, but the actual, like, beginning of the Tomb of the Cybermen begins with the way that all great Doctor Who stories begin, in a rock quarry.
So very true.
We're in a rock quarry on location, and we have our archaeology crew that have landed on the planet of Telos, which is where we will later find out the Cybermen have come to since Mondas, the original home planet, was destroyed by the Doctor. And so we encounter this archaeology crew that is going to be basically make up our entire sort of cast of characters until we encounter the Cybermen themselves, and they... You know, do what, of course this is what all archaeologists do. They take dynamite and they blow the fuck out of the side of a mountain to find their tomb, because that's what archaeologists do. They blow shit up.
To be fair, they are British archaeologists. I can believe it with the Brits.
Yeah, but it is so, because it's something about the sort of the context of this story, I think, is that it is pulling from something that I don't think is, like, as sort of present in pop culture now, but was for a very long time, was that sort of, like, you know, discovering the tomb of King Tut and, like, all of that. Like, I mean, that was not present in 1967. That was, like, the beginning of the 20th century. But it was a part of that culture, and there was, like, more of that fervor. And this does come off of the back also of, you know, a tradition of different sort of, like, Egyptian-themed stories with, like, all these mummy movies that are relevant to this story, because one of our main characters, our main villain, Eric Klieg, is played by the great British character actor George Pastell, who, if you have seen any of the Mummy Hammer horror movies from the 50s, he is a villain in basically all of those. He's playing a different character each time, but each time he's one of the villains from those movies. So this Tomb of the Cybermen is pulling from this sort of, like, tradition of archaeological stories that was something that before this point was never really a thing in Doctor Who. Doctor Who doesn't do this that much later. Like, it does, like I think Silence in the Library is a good example of a modern one, where that is the origin of River Song, is that she's technically an archaeologist. It's easy to forget that because she's never does archaeology really again, but that is how we were introduced to her. But it is something I really love about Tomb of the Cybermen, is that it is this combination of this sort of futuristic sci-fi stuff of the Cybermen with this sort of, like, gothic horror-y kind of, like, mummy Egyptian tomb, like King Tut kind of story.
It's why it's so hard to know what to make of this serial at first, and then why it's so good. And, you know, when I said earlier, like, the first episode to me, like, didn't make the biggest impression on me, that's not me saying it's bad. It's just, like, where's this going? Because I hadn't really seen this. Seemed so different, and that's because this isn't a story where like they come out and are attacked by the Cybermen. The Cybermen are dead and frozen, and they're playing with dynamite here. Like very literally, as you said. And so that's a really interesting dynamic because the first episode is just poking at things that shouldn't be poked at. Yeah, basically. Yeah. But as you say, definitely in that mummy tradition. And when you say like this is something that's not as in vogue here. Here's a great example of that: is look at mummy movies over the years because the Mummy has been remade over and over. The Mummy today is an action movie with Tom Cruise.
Right, yeah. I have not seen that movie, but my
no
impression is that archaeology is not a heavy feature of that movie. No. Based on the trailer, at least, I don't think I saw the inside of the tomb in a single shot in the trailer.
No. Like, the Mummy movies, here, or even the Brendan Fraser ones, which are a very conscious throwback in a lot of ways, that's about, like, a team of archaeologists going out and poking at shit that shouldn't be poked at. Yeah. And it's a great genre, but as you say, it's very much not in vogue now.
Yeah. But it's always, it's a fun sort of weird subgenre that is motivated by like actual real life cultural events of the British discovering the tomb of King Tut and sort of like having to sort of, use the Rosetta Stone to try to like crack what the Egyptian hieroglyphics mean and all that stuff. So this is definitely a lot of the iconography and the sort of the visual element of this serial is pulled from those kinds of stories that gives it a very unique feel to it, I think, even still. And one of those, I think, like one of the great scenes and one of the great visuals that they revisit a couple of times of the story is the door to the tomb. I love that so much, and it's this big door that you find out is electrified, because that's the actual first death we get, which is like sets the tone for the whole story. Is I think it's like one of the random American dudes, because there's 3 British people doing American accents that I think do a good enough job. I believe their transatlantic accent well enough. I will accept that they're Americans. One of the Americans tries to grab the door and is electrocuted and killed immediately, which should be enough of like maybe we haven't thought enough about this expedition for the other archaeologists. But obviously, then the doctor shows up and sort of solves this mystery because he wants to know what's in this tomb as much as anybody else does and sort of like figure out what this whole situation is.
And I like that the Doctor is kind of also guilty of poking at things that shouldn't be poked at in this episode. Yeah. Because, like, probably rule of thumb, you discover a Cyberman tomb, leave it alone.
That would be my going theory as well. Yeah. Even if they have been gone for like 5 centuries or whatever, they're the Cybermen. They're not normal human beings. They don't play by our rules. I would just assume stay the fuck away because you don't know what you're going to act.
I want that to be a Doctor Who story at some point. Let's say it's the next Doctor, Jodie Whittaker. And in one episode, like, she and her new companions, because I'm imagining she gets a posse again, because I miss Doctor Who posses, lands in a rock quarry, as you say, and then they go out and they find a big Cyberman tomb, and one of the companions is like, ooh, what's this, Doctor? And she says, you know what? I've done this before. Back in the TARDIS, go back to the rock quarry. We're leaving. This is a bad idea. Yeah. And then they go to an amusement park or something.
Yes, it's just, they just go to the music park and then they go to the beach and it's like happy fun times.
Yes.
But no, that's not what happens here. But I think so that is how, like, sort of we have that preliminary scene. The scene that would basically be like the cold opening if it was modern Doctor Who of like the archaeologist discovering the tomb and the guy getting shocked. That is absolutely where that's where that would start if this was made, in 2017 instead of 1967. But this is where the Doctor and his companions intersect the story. And this is where, let's start talking a little bit about Patrick Troughton of this story, because one of the hallmarks of the second Doctor to me is that he's he's both like impish and fun and happy and clownish in a lot of ways, but he is also easily the most like scheming of the Doctors, other than I guess the 7th Doctor is also in that realm, but in like a more like sinister way. But Patrick Troughton, like, there's something about his Doctor that he's always manipulating something. He's always like testing somebody. He's always trying to sort of like, because again, he's not physically imposing at all. He's like the most, I mean, he's, Patrick Troughton's a character actor. He's not like that typical leading man figure. You don't see him as someone who's going to like diffuse this whole situation immediately. He has to sort of like be in the background of these scenes and kind of poke at something and ask someone a question, give someone a leading question, and sort of like lead people along where, like, for me, the Doctor's whole motivation here is once he finds out that this is the tomb of the Cybermen, he's going to try to get these people to stop. But no matter what happens, he needs to make sure he understands what the situation is so that the Cybermen do not come back. Because, again, this is the 3rd time the Doctor has encountered the Cybermen. The Cybermen are responsible for his first regeneration or renewal, because regeneration was not the word used yet. And so he's having to sort of tiptoe around the corners of a lot of the scenes and a lot of like the conversations and kind of like push and prod things and kind of help them along in some places and impede them in other places to sort of try to get a grasp of what the situation is. And I love that element of his character, and I think it's one of the things that's most heavily featured in Tomb of the Cybermen.
It's the best part of the first episode is definitely watching all these varying, like, we start to realize, because we're the audience, have this omniscient view that even within this archaeology group, there are differing motives and rivalries and things going on. And then you have Patrick Troughton kind of dancing through all the different groups and trying to manage all of this. And it will eventually spiral out of control.
Yeah.
But watching him do that is very interesting.
Yeah, because they immediately, once they open up the tomb, they encounter all like the logical puzzles or whatever that are all these like symbolic puzzles that sort of like gate your access to the different areas of the tomb. And then there's the great sort of ominous giant hatch that's just like right there, that is there for the first 2 episodes until it's opened, that you always know there's bad shit under that hatch. It's basically like the trap door in the Haunted Mansion. It's like, or in the cabin of Evil Dead. It's like, you don't want to see what's in the hatch, man. Stay the fuck away from the hatch. Of course, everyone wants to see what's in the hatch, but that's a great sort of like visual element throughout the first 2 episodes, is that's this huge hatch that is like omnipresent right by the door. And there's it's one of those sort of like the great pieces of direction is I think there's a very good sense of the space of the tomb and where the rooms are in relation to one another, like where that hatch is, where that hatch leads, where like the hypnosis room is, where the regeneration Cyberman room is that Victoria gets trapped in later.
We talked about this with the Aztecs also. Some of these episodes of Classic Doctor Who are proof that you don't need a lot of money to make great production design. Because I know some of the things we're looking at look kind of cheap and all that. There's a scene where a Cyberman busts out of something and it's clearly paper mache.
Right.
But like, that doesn't matter. Good production design isn't in the budget. It's in the like imagination and geography and all of that. And this is great A+ production design because the atmosphere of this, this tomb, this base that they're in, as you say, like, you get such a good sense of where everything is. It feels so claustrophobic in the right way at different points. And it all just looks so ominous and interesting. And that is great production design 101.
Yeah, it's because it's the kind of thing that most, like, other, like, Doctor Who stories that have to deal with that kind of location oftentimes don't have that, like, great sense of location. If you watch, like, Under the Lake, like, from season 9, which is a great episode, I think like it's a lot harder watching that episode, getting like a full sense of where all these passageways lead to, like where the mess hall is versus where the hangar where that ship is in that episode. Like you have a good enough grasp of it to be able to sort of like that you're not totally confused by it constantly and feeling like it's breaking continuity or something, but it's not giving you that like great holistic sense of like I know exactly where I am in this space because I've spent enough time here, and then there's enough good visual cues with the editing and with the camera direction and with the set design that I know exactly where that hallway leads. I know where this hallway leads. I don't know where that hatch leads, but I know I need to be careful of it because of how the camera focuses on it at certain moments.
This feels like the kind of story that like they made a map before they wrote the story.
Sure, yeah. It's just got that great sort of like physical space and physical sort of like grounding in the story that helps give that sense of tension as they're expanding throughout the tomb, because the whole first episode is that like you go into the tomb and it's just exploring all the different spaces with the Doctor staying in the middle, sort of like, because I think the Doctor identifies very early on that we have a sort of like 2 or kind of like 2.5, like depending on how you count Toberman, because he's an interesting element of the episode. But it's mainly you have these 2 characters, Kaftan, played by Shirley Cookland, and then, as I said earlier, Eric Klieg, played by George Pastel, that are sort of like, they're the financiers of the archaeological mission, and there's something wrong, like, up with these people. They are not interested in the archaeological discoveries going on. They just want to go through that hatch and, like, find the Cybermen, basically, is their only motivation. And so he's sticking with them, while the rest of the crew, led by Professor Perry, who is the sort of like main archaeologist guy, who's like I love that you don't get much of his character, but I love the sense of like he's this beleaguered, kind of down on his luck archaeologist that clearly can't get a normal expedition together, and so Klieg and his like backing have financed him because they know that he's so desperate to go on this like archaeological trip that he will go, like, he's not going to, like, take all the necessary precautions, so they will be able to stick around with him to be able to, like, do what they need to do, because he's not going to be this, like, strong presence. And I like there's enough of that sense of that character there that I think you sort of understand who he is.
The archaeology team is either saps or villains.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, so it's like, so you have that with like Professor Perry, and then there's like two other people with him that are, both of them are going to get killed relatively shortly. And then you have the band of rogue Americans that are like in the spaceship somewhere off screen for most of the story. But yeah, I like the first episode, you have that, you're really exploring that space and seeing like I said, you have this like weird regeneration room with this big cannon and this like Cyberman like sarcophagus thing on the wall that Troughton like tries to like is playing with it and almost kills Victoria. And then you have Jamie and one of the other archaeology crew in this weird hypnosis room that you find out is a weapon testing chamber. And you find that out because, like you said earlier, the guy gets blasted in the back with a Cyberman ray.
One of the great Doctor Who cliffhangers, because it's just a fucking mic drop.
Yeah.
Of like, yeah, this isn't going to go well for anybody.
Yeah. It is something that to highlight of, I think there's something about the way that the violence is used in this story, and we'll definitely talk more about it once we get to episode 4 and talking about like how it's used there. But it is just like people just get fucking shot and then smoke billows out of them and they collapse. They don't do like, the Dalek ray gun effect where it's this like weird flash and like superimposition of a like X-ray skeleton looking thing and then it goes back and they like collapse. It's just people getting fucking shot and smoke billowing out into the place of blood, but it's just them getting shot constantly. And there is something like weirdly present about that violence because it feels like they're not cutting a lot of corners to disguise it from the audience. It's just there.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about, while we're talking about some of the cast here, Toberman
Yes.
and the uncomfortable racial dynamics
Sure.
between the Cybermen?
Yes, Toberman played by Roy Stewart. There's because I have like conflicted feelings about how Toberman is used in the story. Because there's one, like a bit of context is that this is, as far as I can think of, this is the first speaking role that any actor of color has in Doctor Who. Like, unless you kind of count like some actors are like Italian or something. That's the most exotic you usually got. And this is like a black man with a speaking role in this episode. An important detail is that the character was originally supposed to be deaf, and that's one of the main reasons why he doesn't talk for most of it. And eventually, at some point in the scripting, they kind of like abandoned that concept, but didn't totally rewrite his character because I think he was going to be deaf and have like a hearing aid, which was supposed to be like setting up Cyberman stuff, and they got rid of that. So that's like one of the main reasons why he doesn't have a lot of lines is because of that. But there is sort of no getting around at some point that he's like the only black character in the episode. Obviously, this is fucking 1967 Doctor Who. And he is definitely in a subservient role to these two other characters, and he's basically Troughton's sort of like handyman, basically, and going around and sort of he fucks up the spaceship and that
he
kind
is
of stuff.
introduced to us as, we're not strong enough to get this door open, come over here.
Right.
And he's this big, strong black man who is defined by his strength, and is later becomes a like literal slave, as they say, to the Cybermen. And it's there's some uncomfortable stuff here. I think I think you could do a pass at this and make a version of the character that doesn't feel as problematic. But it's problematic by today's standards within the episode.
But I think it's something that, with the historical context of the time, like it's weirdly progressive. Because they do, I think, try to address it somewhat in the narrative by like having him like the Doctor basically straight up says like, you're not their slave, like you're a man, Toberman. Like
yes.
There's also like a lot of gender stuff to talk about in this episode. That some of it I think is like thematically good, and some of it is. But like I think they do integrate some of that stuff into the story, which is like a lot more than you can say for most stuff from 1967.
I agree, and he goes to some interesting places in the last few episodes, but it's like but you never kind of can erase the thing that they, especially when you take out the deafness and some of those things, like just take what's in the episode. He's presented as like the noble savage figure.
Sure.
Like they could have plucked this guy out of the jungle or something. It could have been a line they could have written that would have been more overtly racist, but it's not. So I do like that the Doctor is basically telling him to embrace his own inner humanity. That's a good thing. That's what the Doctor would do. The Doctor is not a space racist.
Right, yeah.
Which is great. But yeah, so...
the other thing I want to like note for Toberman is like, I think one of the reasons I'm kind of conflicted about it is like, fucking Roy Stewart is really good in that role.
No, he is.
Like,
He's great.
Like his physical presence and his physical acting in it is just outstanding, particularly once he gets like the more meaty stuff in the last 2 episodes where he has to kind of fight the cyber control, and then when he just fucking picks up the cyber controller and throws him into the console and like defeats him. Like, that stuff, he's really fucking good.
He sells a very obvious effect, because they don't get rid of that wire. It's on a cyber controller. It's just there, but you buy it.
Yeah.
It's good. Yeah. All right, so in episode 2,
yes,
some crazy shit happens.
Yeah, so you watched this more recently, because I rewatched this like a week and a half ago, so I don't remember exactly where all the episode breaks are. So do you remember like the where episode 2 kind of goes?
Yeah, I mean, part 2, the standout stuff of part 2 is that after that one guy dies, they have some arguments, but then they wind up deciding they figure out how to open that hatch and go down. Victoria is left behind with Captain, and there's a Cybermat running around, and we'll get to that. They'd already seen the Cybermat a little bit, but most of episode 2 is about what they find down in the hatch.
Yeah.
And it leads to the standout sequence of the serial, which is the awakening of the Cybermen. Which is, when I talked earlier about images, that you will have seen this image if you know anything about Doctor Who. That is the thawing of the Cybermen, and I think is like one of the most genuinely horrifying sequences in all of Doctor Who. Yeah. A show which likes to dabble in its horror. This is a genuinely horrifying serial, and the epicenter of that to me is they get down into this icy tomb. They're locked in because Kafka is doing evil things, or Kafkin, whatever her name is, and they get down there and they realize, oh shit, there are Cybermen in a tomb over there. You realize that Krieg is a bad guy and he's trying to thaw them out. And that's how the episode ends, is with them like, I think that's in episode 2 where the guy goes back to like, no, I'm going to refreeze them. And Krieg just fucking shoots him in the back. He dies, goes and then keeps thawing, and the Cybermen come out and they like rip through this like gelatinous, plastic layer and come out. And it's like they are just ratcheting up the tension so much. It is an amazing feat of direction. It's a genuinely impressive special effect, as in I don't quite know how they did it in 1967 at the BBC on that budget.
Right.
And like they just push things pretty extreme. And I can imagine by the end of that episode, like children watching Doctor Who, like, Peter Capaldi at that age, like running behind the couch and crying.
Yeah, and it just being this image sort of like impressed in your memory, because it's one of those things that when I talk about like this story feels like it could just stand alongside classic science fiction. Like, it is those kinds of like images of, like the other movies I mentioned of like The Thing from Another World, and you have like the great classic image of all the scientists in the Antarctic sort of standing around this frozen flying saucer that's below the ice, and they stand around and hold their arms out to sort of like measure the circumference of it. It's this fantastic shot. It has that kind of quality of it. Or the specific thing they do of like having it's sort of like, that kind of like far shot of it frozen over, and then like this almost like kind of time-lapsey looking thing of however they did it, of having it sort of like slowly thaw. It looks like something from like Fritz Lang's Metropolis or something like that. It's that kind of effect.
Oh, there's a ton of Metropolis in this serial, and it does. It looks like some kind of optical fade they're doing, like literal like old-timey tape the film together fade kind of thing they're doing there, but it looks great, and it is just genuinely chilling. This serial also has great music.
Yeah, it's one of the very rare for classic Doctor Who for it to have the music stand out. Like it does. It like once you get to sort of the 80s, it sort of gets a bit flashier, and you kind of notice it more. But yeah, this story in particular, that Cyberman theme of just like the bum bum bottom. Like that is playing over this whole thing, and it's like you have this really heavy drum beat. I mean, it's a great theme.
Yeah, and there's even stuff like that is very advanced for early Doctor Who and just early television, where you will have score over complex intercut sequences where you'll be going like from the group down in the tomb to like Victoria and Kafkin upstairs, like with the Cybermat, and you'll be doing like, Hitchcockian, cutting across scenes, like tension building with the score in there. That's pretty advanced filmmaking for the time, like on TV. Not for film itself, but like for TV, that they were able to do some of that, especially because Doctor Who, like, its production today we would call a soap opera, basically, is how it was shot. That's, like, how you would think of it, in that they did things in one take, and they shot it in sequence and all these things. This feels way more like a film, or, like, modern television, in terms of how it looks like it was shot and assembled.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, so And then episode 3 is where we get into, they get out of the tomb and they're able to lock the Cybermen down, but not before there's another, like, to me, like the secondary standout sequence of the serial, and one I had not seen anything from, is them trying to get out of that fucking hatch. And at the end, it's just the Doctor, Patrick Troughton, and he's being pulled in by the Cyberman. He says, leave me. And Victoria and Jamie both come over to rescue him, and Jamie does this like great like blow to the Cyberman's neck, which is cool. But they wind up getting the Doctor free, and then Victoria gets grabbed, and they wind up getting her free, and then the Cyberman is like stumbling like a Frankenstein monster, and then they're able to close the hatch. That whole sequence is another like masterful piece of Doctor Who action and tension, like rarely matched by the, you know, bigger budget, bigger time modern Doctor Who, of just watching like that sequence unfold where it's like, okay, I know the Doctor lives, but this is crazy good. And the Cyberman at the end of that sequence when it's like stumbling back, it really is an enemy that you are afraid of, and that's awesome.
Yeah, because that's also where after they close the hatch, the Cyberman's like trying to break out, where you can tell that that's like balsa wood or something, like that's something that like the actor could have actually broken out of. But there is something about like, I mean, he fucking actually dents that door. Like that's obviously it's because it's not real metal, but it's a good sense of like threat that the Cybermen have all throughout, and it does have like that whole sort of like extended sequence, because Tomb of the Cybermen is one of the classic Doctor Who stories where, like, every time I've watched it, I've just watched all 4 episodes in one sitting, because I think it just has that sense of pace that you just, like, it drives you from one to the other.
It doesn't have any fat on it.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why it's, like, hard for me to distinguish where episode 2 and 3, like, begin and end, because it is just this, like, really seamless thing. But, yeah, the way the Cybermen are used here and all throughout the episode is so remarkable to me, of just the sort of like visual melding of them being of like very robotic and yet also having that organic element, and which is the key element of the Cybermen, is that you have to sort of sell this uncanny sense of them being both robotic and human at the same time, and having those sort of like two elements of them at war, and having that like, I think it's like one of the characters describes it as like they're like in honeycombs when they're in this like big structure, and then when they wake up, they break out of these like weird sort of like plastic wombs and have to come out, and that like, and they're like the way they very slowly stumble out and like kind of creep out is something like, again, like it's out of like something out of like Metropolis or something like that. It's got a great visual sense, but then also they have that threatening element to them that is so rare for me to be like frightened by the Cybermen in future Cybermen stories. But here they have that like utter power, utter strength. I think part of it is that they have been built up so much that when they finally burst free and are there, you really feel like these are like, you should not fuck with these things. Like, you have very like firmly planted in my mind that like multiple characters have already died just trying to get here. And, like, you really do not want to mess with the Cybermen. Even though, like, obviously, if you've watched, like, the earlier Doctor Who stories, you know what the Cybermen are. Here, they have, like, this really powerful, threatening presence to me that is
part
that,
of
like,
it is
way overshadows how they've been used in anything else.
And part of it is also like the costumes look a little off.
Yeah.
And some of that is obviously budgetary things and all that, but it's also, I think, a choice that like they look a little rough around the edges. They sound a little rough around the edges. That's actually written in as that they need to get more energy. And later on, when the cyber controller does get more energy, he's able to talk a little more normal, but like it is like this slow, stuttering, digitized speech that's so off-putting. Very much feels like something from a sci-fi movie of the period. Yeah. You know, in episode 2, it's either the end of episode 2 or beginning of episode 3 where we meet the cyber controller and Krieg tries to negotiate with him and gets shit on. And the cyber controller is just a great villain. He's got like the Krang brain on his head. It looks awesome. But he's also like, very... Here's how you know he's menacing is that he very rarely like puts out any physical like... attacks on anyone. He's just calm and in the background talking to these people, and he knows he can fuck them all up whenever he wants.
Yeah, and something I love is this is still, because this is, early enough with the Cybermen that every time the Cybermen pop up, they have like a slightly different appearance, and like they're slightly different in the voice here. Is they never use this specific kind of voice with the Cybermen again, and it's so harsh and screeching and digital. Like it's kind of physically painful to hear, which is like it's like I think it really helps that they don't talk that much in the story. So when they do, it's just this like piercing, like electric screech that is really unpleasant. But I think is very effective again at sort of selling the sense of you don't want to fuck with these things. Like, these are things that would have been best left entombed, and Eric Klieg is a maniac for wanting to get them out of here.
Yeah, so a bunch of stuff eventful happens in these middle 2 episodes, because you also have, it's probably in episode 2, you have the sequence where the Cyberman awakens up with Victoria and Kofkin and winds up attacking, am I getting her name right? Yeah, Koftin, sorry. Yeah. Winds up attacking Koftin, and then Victoria kind of has the run of the situation, is able to get the hatch open and everything.
Yeah, that's when she gets the pistol and just blasts the Cyberman, which is just an all-time great moment in Doctor Who history for me, is seeing the female Doctor Who companion just fucking with a gun.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, this is something where you just didn't see guns in stuff that much, particularly on TV. So it's like,
that's still rare in Doctor Who, that people would just pull out a gun. And,
this is a straight-up fucking pistol.
It's why we always joke about the 7th Doctor dying by street violence.
Exactly.
Because that's not something... The Doctor doesn't usually run into just straight-up pistols.
Yeah, it's always some weird ray gun something. It's like, no, this is just... this again, it's like a prop. It's like a gun you'd see in a James Bond movie from the era or something. It's one of those weird snub-nosed pistols.
So anyway, that's fantastic. There's this episode 3 and 4 are this really interesting exploration of these shifting power structures within the group, where enough of the good people have died that now Krieg is very much in charge. Yeah. But when they get out of the tomb, they're able to get him locked in another room, and then he and Koftin find this laser gun that they're able to use to get out, and then they're going to attack the Cybermen with it. But in episode 3, you also get this long night where all the characters are waiting, and there's some downtime, basically for the first time in the story, because this is a pretty breathless story.
And for something that's these kinds of moments were really rare in classic Doctor Who, that you have this just quiet moment for the characters to just sort of stop, that's not really serving the plot, because so much of classic Doctor Who is 100% plot driven. That it is one of the things that also, with last month talking about the Aztecs, there's a couple of moments that are kind of like this, where it's just the plot kind of moves to the background and the characters are sort of foregrounded and have a small character moment that it really stands out. I
mean, and again, I completely agree that you could edit these as a movie and it would be a great movie. And this is kind of like that late second act thing where you're having the long night of the soul with the characters as they're waiting, and you get the scene with the Doctor and Victoria. We mentioned it earlier, where Victoria is talking about her father's death and that she's still sad about it. And the speech Patrick Troughton delivers, I watched that, and 1, holy crap, Patrick Troughton, high five, you're a great fucking actor. 2, I saw every Doctor in that moment. I could just see them flashing across the screen. And that's one of the earliest moments where I think, in at least what I've seen of Classic Doctor Who, where I can say that.
Yeah. So I have the dialogue here, so I'm just going to read this dialogue, because this is such an iconic scene for me. It's one of my favorites. So the Doctor starts with, "Are you happy with us, Victoria?" "Yes, I am. At least I would be if my father were here." "Yes, I know. I wonder what he would have thought if he could see me now. You miss him very much, don't you?" "It's only when I close my eyes. I can still see him standing there before those horrible Dalek creatures came to the house. He was a very kind man. I shall never forget him. Never." "No, of course you won't. But, the memory of him won't always be a sad one." "I think it will. You can't understand being so ancient." "Eh? I mean old." "Oh. You probably can't remember your family." "Oh, yes, I can, when I want to. And that's the point, really. I have to really want to bring them back in front of my eyes. The rest of the time, they sleep in my mind, and I forget. And so will you. Oh, yes, you will. You'll find there's so much else to think about, to remember. Our lives are different to anybody else's. That's the exciting thing. There's nobody in the universe can do what we're doing."
The miracle of Doctor Who, from its inception, is that a show made on this timetable, on this budget, with these resources, traditionally shouldn't have been able to get writing that good out the door.
Yeah.
And Doctor Who did it somewhat routinely in its early years, because William Hartnell has his own share of speeches that beautiful, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of them. That's an all-time great piece of TV writing.
Yeah, and it really has this, it's such a, I mean, it is a very Doctor moment, but it's also just a very second Doctor moment of him, because he has that sort of kindly uncle quality to him of just sort of sitting down and kind of putting his arm over her and having this conversation. And I love, it's one of the things about Patrick Troughton is he's so funny. So you have that being so ancient, I mean old, that those weird little like moments that like sometimes almost feel like improvised. They probably weren't, but there's something about like Patrick Troughton is so spontaneous in so many ways that you can just sort of imagine that that's just something that happened while filming, which is possible that it is because they could only basically do one take for these kinds of scenes. So if that was improvised, that was going in, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it is just it's such a powerful moment for this character that also shows. Again, like it's something that's sort of important to think about is that this is the first. I mean, obviously, this is after Patrick Troughton has been around for a season, but this is like in a larger sense, this is the first time any other actor had taken over the role of the Doctor. It was a totally new concept, and I think there is something in this scene that you can see. Both you can see a bit of that like William Hartnell, like grandfather Twinkle in the Eye thing there, but you also get the sense of like that slow character progression from the like really harsh season 1 like an Unearthly Child and 10,000 BC William Hartnell to this figure that we're with now that is like pretty confident, is incredibly caring, and is and it's something that like to talk about. I want to go deeper into this later about like I think my like bigger sort of like thematic reading of the whole story, but he has this sort of like emotional intelligence to him, this emotional perception to him that in this moment, because I think it's important to like note like nothing happens that prompts this conversation. The Doctor goes up to her in the middle of the night and asks, "Are you happy with this Victorian?" There's like no, she's not crying or something. There's nothing big. Like he just sort of like wakes up in the night, sees her, walks over, and they start talking. And there's something about that you sort of get that sense of that he has these sort of perceptive faculties operating at all times, whether it's in a plot sense with him, like in earlier scenes. I love in an earlier scene when Clee is trying to get the hatch open, and he obviously has the equation wrong, and so when he's not looking, the Doctor sort of like just twists the dial and like kind of like looks over to the side. So he's got that sort of like manipulative capacity in the plot, but he also has these sort of like emotional perceptive faculties with his companions that he's able to sort of identify the issues that they're dealing with and have this like moment to take them aside and talk to them and help them through that.
Yeah. There's something I kind of thought about while watching this scene and this whole serial, in fact, is that Patrick Troughton, and we've talked about this before, that Patrick Troughton so much is the model for many of the Doctors to come, but particularly I think modern Doctor Who. Yeah. Like, he feels like you could take Patrick Troughton in any Second Doctor story, plop him into a modern Doctor Who with the modern production values and all that, and he'd feel right at home.
Yeah.
And this is one of those moments to me where I saw that, where it's just that I think there is such influence in that moment and in the performance he gives where, you know, you talked earlier about some of the, I think, specific unique things Patrick Troughton does with the character, like how he's kind of sly in how he uses his physicality and stuff. But there's also, like, the way he plays a dual version of the character where he has kind of a forward-looking face and then something he kind of keeps for himself, that emotional intelligence, all these things. So many of the things that I think we think of as, like, fundamental parts of the Doctor, I don't know if they completely originate with Patrick Troughton, but they solidify with him in moments like these. And when I say I can just see the faces of other Doctors, for instance, a good example is Matt Smith always talked about how Tomb of the Cybermen was an influence. Watch that scene and then think of any heart-to-heart Matt Smith had with Amy Pond.
Yeah.
He is pulling from that moment, and he's doing it beautifully. And I think one of the things Patrick Troughton captures there is that sense of the Doctor as, you know, alien, ageless, been around forever, but also has all this wisdom and empathy to give, which is one of my favorite modes of the Doctors. You know, Peter Capaldi is a fairly different Doctor than Patrick Troughton. He's the most different of the modern Doctors by far, and yet I can also see him giving that speech. He could have done that with Clara at some point, you know? So it's really cool to see a moment like that and be like, right, 50, because this serial is 50 years old this year, this month, because this was the September 1967. Not planned, but that's kind of cool that worked out that way. But yeah, 50 years, and this still feels like a great blueprint and a vital blueprint for how to do the Doctor and the series.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just, you know, Patrick Troughton was just an incredible actor, and like particularly in this role, like he brought so much to that, and particularly when you think about like how intense the production was for these kinds of episodes, to like think of like how skillfully he's able to sort of like manage all these like weird different elements of the physicality of the character that is like really sort of like, because, you know, obviously like William Hartnell has a physicality to the role, but it's because he's older, like it's not as sort of like forefronted, whereas like Patrick Troughton has this like comic physical element to him that is like really present in these episodes, but then also has all this sort of like scheming going on in the background that you can see in the corners. That's like being able to sort of like bring that kind of nuance to those scenes is really incredible.
Well, when I say that physicality, like when I talk about like modern Doctor Who's, it's like when you think of all the gesticulating that Matt Smith and David Tennant do,
and all like the weird faces and stuff.
That's an extension of Patrick Troughton, you know. Because William Hartnell has a different kind of physical. I think he's doing a lot of physical acting. William Hartnell
absolutely,
which is a very different kind.
Yeah.
You know, and So here I had a question.
Okay.
William Hartnell, as you'll learn if you watch that TV documentary, Adventures in Outer Space,
yeah.
was deeply beloved for Doctor Who.
Yeah.
And probably a big deal when he left and was replaced. And I just don't know this. Do you know anything? How was Patrick Troughton received in his day? Because that had to be a tough thing to take over that role.
Really well. Like I think like there were some like it's not all present for me because I have actually like researched this and read a bunch of like reviews that were in the newspapers at the time. And some of them were not accepting, but like very quickly people just sort of, I think it was like by the end of that first serial, people were just like, yeah, no, this is him, because he was incredibly popular in the role and left because, one, I think the production schedule was very intense, and then also he didn't want to be typecast because he was this fantastic character actor before Doctor Who, and then he also had a very successful character acting career after Doctor Who, and so I think it was probably smart for him to leave when he did and sort of like maintain this mystique of being able to be, because he's like, it's something if you haven't seen his roles in other movies, although you probably have seen his role in other movies because he's in a lot of stuff, like he's in Jason and the Argonauts, he's in The Omen, he's in some more popular movies, but he's a very sort of chameleon-like actor, like he could take on any sort of role and sort of like fall into that role, and in some ways, like his role as the Doctor in Doctor Who is like his most, like it feels like you just see the guy there, you don't, like he's not in all this makeup and all this weird stuff, he's just him.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important moment to think about, because if that had gone south, like they hadn't picked the right guy, that's it for Doctor Who. But yeah, it's so cool to me to hear that he was appreciated too, because that's how Doctor Who worked and continues to work, is that you have one beloved actor, and then you say goodbye, and then you bring on someone else, and you learn to love them really fast.
Yeah.
And luckily, they've never missed a beat on that part.
They can always, even when like other elements of the show maybe were not working, like they always nailed the casting 100%.
Yeah, like I've even said, like, you know, what's the first Colin Baker story? The Twin Dilemma?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a horrible story. Colin Baker's awesome in that, and I watched it, it's like, and you just fall in love with him too. So it's one of the magic things. We're getting off topic, but it's a cool, you have to consider with Patrick Troughton, because William Hartnell is the first Doctor. Patrick Troughton is the first guy who had to step into the role of the Doctor.
Exactly, like the role that was already made and had to sort of like make all these choices about like, what do I take from that other performance? What do I change? Like, what do I do with this? And it's so masterful the way that you can feel a continuity of character there, and yet he is different enough to be incredibly exciting and you know, invigorating every time you sort of like compare and contrast the different performances.
Yeah. So within episode 3, we also have the thing where Toberman gets taken over by the Cybermen, and all that. And then episode 4 is fucking chaotic, because so much happens in that final episode. Like, I kept checking the time, like, how much time is left? And we had 10 minutes left, and I'm like, they got a lot to wrap up here.
Yeah.
Because basically there's a whole thing where they wind up back in the tomb, and the cyber controller gets out, and he's got Toberman, and Krieg thinks Toberman is on his side, but he's really working for the cyber controller, and there's Toberman gets his like redemptive arc and all this stuff, and then they think they've won, but then the Doctor's like, no, we're going to go back in the tomb and freeze those motherfuckers, and then they do that, but then the cyber controller is really alive, and there's the electric door. There's so much happens in that final episode. It is like balls to the wall until the very end, to the point where this isn't even one of those series that's a preview for next time. It's just, we're back in the rock quarry. That's it.
It's just, like there's a lot of action, there's a lot of sort of like moving pieces. It also, episode 4 has one of my favorite sort of like less emotional, but like sort of comic scene that this gets me every single time I watch this story, is it's when they're back in the icy tombs, and Klieg has like, you know, gone all the way, and he's just nuts, and he has his laser gun, and he's trying to sort of like convince everyone that's like, this time I can do it, like I can get the Cybermen to work for us. And the Doctor has this exchange with him. Don't you see what this is going to mean to all the people who come to serve Klieg, the all-powerful? Why, no country, no person would dare to have a single thought that was not your own. Eric Klieg's own conception of the way of life. And Klieg goes, brilliant! Yes, you're right, master of the world. Well, now I know you're mad. I just wanted to make sure.
That is a phenomenal moment. I burst out laughing. That is the turn Patrick Troughton does of building him up and then knocking him down is piercing. It is brutal. It is great.
It's so hilarious. I think it's one of the funniest moments Troughton has. Like, he's able to pull that so perfectly, and I think that's where like with episode 4 for me, like one of the things to talk about is with I think one of the core sort of themes of the story, and I think one of the reasons why this is such a great Cyberman story, is that to me, Tomb of the Cybermen is in a lot of ways about that sort of like perceived like difference between emotion and logic, and like putting them on that spectrum where they're diametrically opposed. Because the whole thing with Eric Klieg is that he works for, I forget what it has like some ridiculous name, it's like the Consortium of Logic or some crazy, the Brotherhood of Logicians.
Yes.
So he's working
Which I thought for a little while he was saying magicians, and I had, because the audio isn't great on these old stories. It's logicians, yes, but that's
because it's also, that's not a word you hear very often, is logician, the personal noun version of logic. But yeah, so he's working for them because the Brotherhood of Logicians thinks that they can, use logic to sort of like solve all the problems in the universe, and all they need is power to be able to enforce those ideals. And so the reason why Klieg wants to go get the Cybermen is so that he can use their power to enforce these logical ideals about how the universe should work. And he assumes that the Cybermen would want to go along with that because the Cybermen also operate on logical principles. Because the whole idea of the Cybermen is that that humans on Mondas, like the Mondasian humans, whatever, at some point in their future, sort of removed. To survive, they had to remove basically their emotions and had to become totally robotic in that way, because they wouldn't be able to sort of psychologically withstand being robot people, because it's like they would be too afraid and in too much pain constantly to be able to sort of psychologically withstand that, so they cut out their emotions. So that's sort of like the background for the Cybermen to construct this idea that they are purely logical, and that has been always something that Cybermen, like in all the Cybermen stories, has been one of the consistent things they try to always hit on. It's like they're logic. Emotion is bad. We cut out emotion. We're only logic. In a way that is like, Vulcans in Star Trek. It's that kind of like sci-fi concept. And so Klieg wants that and sort of professes this idea of, I'm all logic all the time, no emotions. Emotions are useless to humans. That it's terrible. Like, emotions are just going to are what have led the galaxy to ruination, and logic is what's going to put it in order. And this story, I think, is just like a top to bottom refute of that sort of idolatry and idolization of logic as the sort of defining principle by which humans need to exist. And what I like about the story is that, to me, I think it kind of breaks down that idea that you have like something that's on like the far emotional scale, and then like something's on the far logical scale, and that they are diametrically opposed. And instead, what the Doctor as a character, as like sort of this like paragon character, shows us is that they're not diametrically opposed. They both work in tandem, and you need them to be balanced and harmonized, because logic on its own doesn't have any motive, it doesn't have any power, it doesn't have anything to it. It's just, logic is just a tool by which you implement yourself and like your ideas and your motivations. Emotion is what drives those motivations and gives logic a purpose. And so you need to have those things be in tandem in conversation for either of them to be useful. And the fact that the Doctor, I think, has those things in perfect harmony is what allows him to sort of, in that moment of like that funny scene where he sort of like builds Klieg up and then knocks him down, he's able to do that because he both has the emotional perception to understand where Klieg is mentally, and also the logic to be able to interrogate and manipulate that in some way. And Klieg, for all his sort of like protestations of like, I am all logic, he's the most emotional character of all of them. He's so emotional that he's completely irrational and is completely off his fucking rocker. He's the exact opposite of logical. And because he's trying to pursue logic on its own, he completely ignores the emotional component that is driving that logic the entire time. And by ignoring it, it drives him to insanity, basically.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something about that storytelling in the background that happens that I think is so phenomenal. And it's such a perfect use of the Cybermen, because also the way the Cybermen are used in the story, I love their whole motivation, and their only motivation is just survival. And the Cyber Controller, especially at the end, the last things that the Cyberman Controller says is just, we will survive, we will survive, we will survive, as he's electrocuted to death. That they are the most like basic life form you can imagine. Their only motivation is survival, and that's it. They don't care about anything else. They just want to survive and reproduce. and that's it, because that is what a purely logical life form, that's the most you can assume they would do, because what else would they have to do if they don't have emotion to drive any other action? And so I think that sort of construction, it's one of the most interesting versions of that kind of thematic idea I've seen done in sci-fi, because I think Star Trek typically sort of ignores all the questions of like, how would a purely logical life form, what the fuck does that actually mean? Star Trek kind of like sidesteps that most of the time. It just has Vulcans there and you just assume that that's part of their backstory. And this story, I think, really engages with that idea.
Yeah, no, there's a lot going on here, in addition to just a lot of kick-ass stuff near the end.
Yeah,
and
because all of that is couched in just like a lot of fun, crazy action with like the cyber controller on one hand, the Doctor and his companions on one hand, and then Eric Klieg and the Captain on the other, all competing with each other.
The way the body count goes down in the last episode, where Klieg wants Toberman to kill like the Doctor and his companions, and Toberman is like, or to kill the Cybermen, and then the cyber controller turns him on that, and he like knocks out Klieg and like murders Captain. And then the Doctor's able to like bring him back, and he takes out the cyber controller. But then Klieg comes back and comes down into the tube with them. And Toberman, I forget exactly how Klieg dies, but it's brutal, and he gets shot by a Cyberman or something. And then at the end, they think they're all safe. And then the cyber controller is coming out through the door, and Toberman has to come up because he's the only one powerful enough to shut it. And he and the cyber controller get electrocuted to death. It's just like all the way to the end. There's a body count racking up here. And, one of those things the 12th Doctor is probably thinking about on his deathbed, where he's like, I don't want to regenerate, is like, I've seen too much shit, man.
Yeah, because basically every character except for, like, the leader of the archaeological expedition, like 3 of the Americans, and then the Doctor and his 2 companions, those are the only characters that survive. Everyone else is killed, either shot or electrocuted.
Yes, it's fairly brutal. So, what else is there to say? Anything more about Tomb of the Cybermen before we wrap this episode up?
I think we just about covered it. It's it's a classic for a reason.
Yeah. And again, talking about it's really well directed. This is another one where I'm like, when Doctor Who made the shift to color, it did some cool things with it. There's something I love about black and white Doctor Who. It's not like, again, they had like the time to like really consider how they're going to use contrast and texture and all those things. But just like the filmic black and white heightens the atmosphere of some of these episodes. And this is one of them.
And I think it helps make some of like the cheap production stuff not be as glaring. That I think it helps just give that sense of atmosphere to the tomb that I think in color it wouldn't stand out as well. Or you'd have to do something very different.
Well, this whole episode, the production design feels like it was so considered for black and white. Like, the Cybermen are black and white. It's all like ice and walls and things like that. The kind of things that, again, thinking of 1950s, 60s horror movies, I'm also thinking of like The Incredible Shrinking Man is a good one. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff like that where it feels like that's the same kind of considerations. But yeah, if you have not seen this one, I mean, this is a great classic Doctor Who to start with, also.
Absolutely,
And I'm sure has been many people's entry into classic Who.
Yeah, it is brilliant. If you get the DVD release, there are a lot of great special features on that as well that talk to you a lot about King Tut's tomb and that kind of stuff, and it's all fun. It's good stuff.
So, Sean, next month for October, we'll be doing a 3rd Doctor story, Mr. John Pertwee, who we all love. The longest-serving Doctor behind the one who followed him, 4th Doctor.
Exactly, yes. John Pertwee was around for 5 years.
So we're entering a period of long stability for Doctor Who.
Yes, and a very different and unique era of Doctor Who that is fascinating. It's the first time Doctor Who moves into color, so we're getting color episodes. Next time, if people listening to this have a severe dislike of black and white, which, I don't agree with, but I can understand. We're moving into the era of color, of Technicolor. It's fucking 70s. It's crazy. John Pertwee. We are going to watch the story The Demons, which is spelled Daemons, so you can call it Daemons if you want. And it's very exciting because it has, one of the reasons I picked it is it has, as far as I remember, basically the entirety of the unit cast. So we get the Brigadier, we get Sergeant Benton, and I believe it even has Captain Mike Yates in it. We get our companion, of course, is Joe. So we get her, Joe Grant, and then, of course, finally, we get to talk about fucking Roger Delgado's master.
Okay, good.
On screen.
I have seen several 3rd Doctor stories. I might have seen more 3rd Doctor than any other classic Doctor, but I have not seen a Master story.
Yes, so Roger Delgado, the Master, is in there, and we get to talk about the whole new, and only in this episode, monster, the Demons.
Oh, I'm very excited to watch this, Sean.
It's very good from what I remember, and I haven't seen it in a long time, which is one of the secret reasons why I picked it, is I just really wanted to rewatch it.
All right, so the demons, or the daemons, to say it phonetically, we're going to watch that for next month, and we'll be back in October with another Doctor Who episode. Subscribe to the Patreon if you want them early. Be sure to keep listening to the regular podcast. We're barreling towards, we're going to get new Doctor Who in a few months here, Sean, in December.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of good Doctor Who stuff coming down the pike. We'll see you guys next time.
I can't wait.